At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Just before I introduce my next special guest, I'd like to take a few moments with you to check in on how the pod's been evolving and where it's branching out to next. I've always said this podcast is about shining a positive and curious light on the hidden network of tree appreciating people everywhere, and that absolutely includes every one of you, our listeners. Having laid down some solid roots in season 1, we've now grown on into season 2, and for the last few episodes, we've spent some time down in the southern hemisphere asking questions about trees and what they mean to the people of the South Pacific, and more specifically, the people of Fiji. Be sure to check out the amazing Sentinel short film, which is available free on the podcast YouTube channel, and such a meaningful personal highlight for me in the whole podcast story so far. Today though, and across the coming weeks, we'll be coming back to the Northern Hemisphere for a bit, and I've got some super interesting people lined up that I can't wait to introduce to you as we continue to deepen our collective understandings around the many weird and wonderful ways we all see and appreciate trees and forests today. If you haven't noticed already, episodes always come out on a Sunday morning whenever they're available, and in between, feel free to visit and interact with our social channels for additional and exclusive content there. If you're a brand new listener, hopefully you've seen that there's a whole treasure trove of episodes to explore in the Meaning of Trees podcast's back catalogue. I wonder what new perspectives you might discover there. And one final ask before we jump into the upcoming interview then, and that is that if you're a listener on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be awesome if you could rate the podcast and leave a comment there to let me and others know how you're finding the whole experience. A big thanks to anyone who might find a couple of minutes to do this in your busy lives. All right, so that's us fully up to date now. And without further ado, let's crack on and meet our guest, shall we? Chantal Lyons is the author of Groundbreakers, a book advocating for the special place and role of wild boar in our UK ecosystems, woodlands and forests. After a few hours walking round the Forest of Dean, which is a wild boar stronghold and somewhere that Chantal has studied in great depth, we sat down and I interviewed her all about this amazing species and what exactly makes it so essential. Chantal, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
First of all, thanks for a fascinating walk around the Forest of Dean just now. You've really kind of brought to my imagination the role of wild boar in our forests in the UK through that short walk. And I'm really excited now to share some of that learning and some of the questions I've got about that special animal and your relationship with it with our listeners now. First though, we're going to go into the classic question, what do trees mean to you?
Yeah, I do love this question. It's one that's had me thinking, and I suppose my relationship with them has definitely changed over time. I notice them more. I try to differentiate between different species, noticing certain aspects such as the way that ash buds look like the paws of a little dog or a deer. But also I've found it so fascinating, the things I've been learning, especially over the last years, about trees, such as the way that they all essentially kind of have different personalities and the way they grow and their experiences shape their whole lives, the structure, their behavior in terms of when they use their resources, everything like that. So yeah, it's a very, hopefully a complex, rich relationship that I have with trees.
Yeah, and leading on from that then, you obviously have spent a lot of time around the Forest of Dean and really got to know it well. and immersed yourself into that place and the local area. Tell us a bit more about that story of how that connection began and, yeah, where did you go with it?
Yeah, and that is also the story of how I came to know Boar as well. I first went to the Forest of Dean in 2014 because I was doing a dissertation for my environmental social science masters and decided I would go and speak to local residents there about what it was like to find themselves living alongside wild boar, because they were in this very unique position. Forest of Dean was home to the biggest population of wild boar in the country, certainly in terms of density. You know, there were lots of opportunities for boar and people to come across each other. And at the same time, I also, as well as falling in love with the boar themselves, I fell in love with the place. And 7 years later, I found myself moving there because I had just got a contract to write this book about wild boar because no one else in the intervening 7 years had written about them. So I thought, I'm going to give it a go. And so I moved there because, as you say, I wanted to immerse myself in that world of the boar and to reconnect with people I'd spoken to before. But it was a wonderful opportunity to sink into the Forest of Dean and to feel at home with it. And the place I moved to, the woodland next to that, which was on my doorstep, really became my place. And I still go back there sometimes and walk the routes I used to walk every day. And it's wonderful. And I just loved being there in amongst the trees.
This might sound funny, but have you always been attracted to boars?
Definitely not. It's funny. I mean, I have a lot of French family, and I spent a lot of my summers in the French countryside, and there have always been boar there. Unlike the UK, where we drove them to extinction by around the end of the 1200s, they've always been present in mainland Europe. And yet, while there is a lot of hysteria here in the UK about the return of boar, in places like France, they're a fact of life. You know, people shrug, give the Gallic shrug. And when we were children, we would just roam around the countryside all the time. And no one ever thought to say, oh, watch out for the wild boar, because you don't need to tell kids that, because they're a fact of life and they're no more dangerous than the average dog, less dangerous than the average dog, actually, I would say. And that is to say that I didn't give a second thought about wild boar until I read Feral by George Monbiot in 2013. And that put wild boar on the radar for me. And then a year later, when I needed to choose a dissertation topic, I heard about all the stories coming out of the Forest of Dean about the boar. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And I was sort of, that was it for me. That's when the boar captured me.
And what do they mean to you now then?
They're almost a gateway to me. They're a gateway to so many sort of human issues and conflicts. They are a symbol of rewilding. They are also a test, I think, for the UK, for the British people. You know, if we can't live with wild boar, how can we live with all the other beings that we need to live with if we want to have a fully restored nature in the UK? But I guess going a bit more personal again, they are a symbol of hope. They are this tenacious species which has regained a hoofhold in the country. Obviously, it was human hands that put them back, you know, whether by illegally releasing them or putting them in farms and then the boar escaping. But I can't help but admire them for the way that the populations we do have persisted, despite a lot of guns and a lot of animosity towards them from people.
Yeah, and do you mind just sharing a bit of the backstory of boar in the UK? How have we still got them now, even though it's in a small number?
Boar have always been, or were until 700 years ago, a very common animal. There were loads of them around. I mean, it was estimated that perhaps there were 1 million in the Mesolithic, and that was the time just before we started farming in this country. But then farming communities migrated to Britain, and as we started to cut down the trees, obviously we were reducing their habitat. We also brought over domestic pigs, which are themselves wild boar, but domesticated versions. And those were from animals we had domesticated as far away as the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. And so we brought those pigs over. So now we have pigs. So the wild boar are less important to us as a source of meat. They are also now a pest because they can damage our croplands. They can be very pesky and interbreeding with our domestic pigs. And we wanted to keep our domestic pigs sort of pure. We didn't want wild boar lineages coming into our domestic pig herds. And at the same time, we were still hunting them. And obviously, as wild boar numbers dropped, they became an animal that was to be hunted by royalty only. So there were laws around them. But that wasn't enough to prevent their extinction from the United Kingdom, or obviously then just just Britain. And see, by the time of the Anglo-Saxons, around the 1200s, we had something like 10% woodland cover, much less than it used to be. And wild boar are very adaptable, but they need a core of woodland. That is really the heart of their home. It's where they shelter. It's where they forage. And so the more we cut the trees down, the more the wild boar found it harder to live. And by the end of the 1200s, we hunted them to extinction. There's a bit of discussion about whether they lasted for longer. You might sometimes see sources saying they've only been gone 300 years, but it's possible that in those cases they were wealthy landowners importing boar back from the continent because, of course, they were never lost from the continent. And then the story starts again in the late 1980s. So there was a bit of a wild boar meat bubble. Farmers started to set up farms and they imported farmed wild boar from the continent, set up farms here. And boar and pigs are very good at escaping. You really need really good fencing to stop them getting out. And so escapes started happening. And actually, the first time we know of an escape happening was in a farm in Tenterden in Kent in 1987, the night of the Great Storm, when a tree took a fence down, and the rest is history. But Kent in East Sussex was the first stronghold of the boar. It was the first place we really seemed to have become aware that there were boar back in the wild. The population started to grow and grow through the 90s, and it seemed pretty healthy in the early 2000s. Around the same time, there were breeding populations popping up in Devon and Dorset, and also the Forest of Dean, and then also a few spots in Scotland. But the things continue to evolve. While the Forest of Dean still has a healthy population, they seem to be on the way out in Kent and East Sussex, and they seem to have been completely hunted to extinction again in Devon and Dorset.
Wow, thanks so much for that. What a great account. And I know that people's perceptions of wild boar are of a fearsome creature. Definitely those tusks play a part, and they perhaps have a role in mythology and lost culture here. And yeah, they strike fear into people, don't they? So for them to arrive at the Forest of Dean and become commonplace, there's been a bit of an adjustment period for people to allow them to be reintegrated into their everyday lives. Is that fair to say?
Definitely. It's interesting because things have really changed actually in the Forest of Dean, but now with the boar becoming a more visible presence in places like Inverness in Scotland, you're almost seeing the same story happening again. But essentially, when I first went to the Forest of Dean in 2014 and spoke to people there was a lot of fear around the boar. There were quite a few people who said to me word for word, it's only a matter of time before a child is killed. And there was a woman who was so afraid of the boar. She said, well, what if I fall off my horse in the woods, I break my leg and I can't drag myself away? What if they come and eat me alive? And that just goes to show the depth of feeling that people were experiencing. And I don't want to just write these off as hysteria. I mean, these were feelings that people were experiencing. But obviously, no child has been killed. There has been just about one minor injury to people. And even the woman I spoke to who was so afraid of them that she thought they might eat her alive is now okay with them. She doesn't like the fact that they're around still because she loves her bluebell woods and they do eat bluebells, I'm afraid to say. But she is not afraid of them harming her because she is able to manage the encounters. When she sees them, she says she screams or shouts at them and they run away. And that is indeed what they normally do. And usually you don't even see them. Obviously, we walked around for a fair bit. I took Tom to a place where I have seen boar before. There was a lot of fresh poo on the ground. And there's this fortress of brambles there. And I have sat outside there in the dusk and watched and listened to boar coming out of these brambles. So very likely there were some boar hunkered up in there listening to us chat about their poo. But they, for the most part, just want to be left alone. And obviously, a lot of the time we've encountered boar in history has been when we've been hunting them and cornering them and killing them. And then boar will absolutely defend themselves when they're in danger. They can be very ferocious, and they certainly have the armory to defend themselves with their tusks and their teeth and their bulk if, when we attack them. But unprovoked attacks are very rare. And in the Forest of Dean, there have been brushes with dogs. Some dogs have been injured, but people largely have been fine. They are pretty much like any other animal. Unlike deer, they do sometimes stand their ground. If they've got babies, they may be inclined to sort of walk towards you and try to ward you off, but they are communicating to you. They're saying, can you just please go away? I'm trying to look after some babies here. And these are encounters that we can manage, we can enjoy and take pleasure from.
Have you got any particular memories in your time studying them closely where you've had any hairy encounters or perhaps come up against a mum with some younger...
Humbugs is the popular word because they look so much like the sweet, sort of brown with those white, those pale caramelly stripes.
Yeah, and actually, now you mentioned that stripe, we had a conversation earlier about the new Lion King movie. What's your beef with that one?
Oh, yeah. So obviously we've got Pumbaa in that, and then they show Pumbaa as a baby warthog. And for some reason, the animators decided not to use a baby warthog, but to actually depict Pumbaa as a baby boar, because you can see in the film that it's a baby boar. It's the shape of a boar. It's got the stripes
humbug,
of a
right?
baby boar. Yeah.
Yeah.
But baby warthogs actually just look like miniature adult warthogs.
And so, yeah, back to my question about when you were studying them, was there any times when you felt unsafe, or flipping that actually, any times that were particularly magical?
The only time I felt a frisson of fear, I guess, with the boar was this time when actually we were in the same village where we met, and there's this sort of common area which there is a group of boar that does hang around the area, and I'd heard about this, so I went walking there at dusk thinking that's probably a wild goose chase. But actually I did then come across some boar. I heard them rummaging and rustling in the bushes, so I sort of crouched behind some brambles and I'd listened to them. And then one of the boar stepped out onto the path, and I thought, oh, she's going to run away, as they always do. But actually this time she stood her ground, and she started doing this dance on the path where she'd sort of keep sort of turning away from me. And I remembered actually a photographer years back had told me about how they do this sometimes to sort of present themselves and show how big they are. And so she was sort of basically trying to intimidate me. And I guess I wasn't intimidated by that so much as this unusual experience, the fact that, okay, for the first time she's not running away from me, which is a really unusual thing for a British animal. We are so used to, anytime we see a deer or a badger, them running away. Foxes in cities, okay, sometimes they're a bit casual. We British people are not used to other animals standing their ground. We're used to being afraid of and other animals running away from us. And this boar, she wasn't running away. And I didn't want to cause her further stress. I didn't want the situation to escalate in any way. So I sort of backed off and slowly walked away. And as I sort of looked over my shoulder, she was still there on the path, enjoying her dominance, I guess, which she was quite entitled to. I think I was happy to cede the path to her. In terms of magical experiences, I mean, I have quite a few times now seen mothers with babies as well. And in all those cases, they ran away. It's interesting, actually. You do notice sometimes, well, every group of females, the females live in groups called sounders, and they raise their babies together. And there's always a matriarch, the leader. She's usually the oldest, wisest one. And also she often tends to be darker because they get darker in colour as they get older. But this group, who would often be in the woods near where I lived, so there were quite a few mornings where I was able to watch them foraging amongst the bluebells. And every time they realised I was there, one of the mums would grunt. Everyone, including all the babies, there were about 15 babies, and they would all just run away in one very specific direction. And the matriarch, she would stand her ground for a bit. She'd sort of stand there and stare at me while the others ran away. And then when she was sure they'd had enough time to get away, she'd then follow after them. And again, that wasn't aggressive. That was just sort of covering their retreat, basically. So I never felt threatened when I came across a mother with babies. And the really magical time was when I was walking up this steep hill, and I paused for breath, and I suddenly realised in front of me there was essentially a nest of 6 baby boar. They were sort of stacked on free, just sleeping, where their mum had stashed them to obviously while she went off and foraged or something like that. And they didn't know I was there, and I didn't want to scare them or scare the mum if she came back. So I took a photo, I lingered for another few seconds, and then I quietly left. But it was wonderful to see them just sleeping there in the bracken.
How wonderful. Yeah, that must have really sort of helped to cement your relationship with them. And what other kind of behaviours have you observed in your work and research for the Groundbreakers book?
Well, the annoying thing is about boar, because of the fact that they are actually quite shy in reality, is that it's really hard to watch them. But I found a lot of use in my trail camera, and that was a way to really see sides of the boar that you don't usually get to see in the daylight and when you're a person watching them, because, either they run away or they're so tense they don't want to do the things that they do in their own company. So this trail camera, which I'd often put in front of this big wallow near where I lived, and this wallow was a real sort of congregating point for lots of boar. It's like a spa where all these different groups went to. And I saw some brilliant things. There was this bachelor group of young boars, a young male boar, they get kicked out of the sounder and they eventually live lives of solitude, but they often gang together in what scientists call bachelor groups. And this group of young bachelors, they were just like lads. They were boisterous. They were always shoving each other around. They were sometimes humped each other. So they were great fun to watch. And you'd see lots of other interesting behavior. You'd see them actually in the wallow having a great time in there. They would pee in the wallow sometimes, which seemed to be a deliberate act, kind of probably has a kind of sexual function. The males especially do that. You'd even see some other wildlife using the wallow. During the drought of 2022, I saw sparrowhawks and owls coming down to bathe. My camera even captured frogs hopping out of the wallow sometimes. So it just goes to show what a resource that wallow that the boar had made was for other wildlife. And then also there's a big tree behind that wallow where all the boar then rub the mud off. And they also like to notch the bark with their teeth because it leaves their saliva on there, and then they all sniff each other's saliva and so they can tell who's been there.
Yeah.
And they also love rubbing their bums on that tree. I could basically make a 5-minute compilation of every sort of boar bottom that's that they've rubbed against that tree, and it's always fun to watch. And sometimes they get so into it they sort of fall off, they lose their footing and just sort of flop onto the ground. So you do see those undignified moments as well, but it's lovely insight sort of into their lives that we don't normally get to see.
Yeah, and what you're kind of talking to there is quite a messy relationship with trees, actually.
Yeah.
And I guess it can be quite a nuanced thing to talk about because they do create damage just through their behaviours. Maybe you want to just explain a little bit about how that might eventually lead to a healthier, more sustainable woodland longer term.
That's a big and long and complex story, really. But the crucial thing that boar do, and it's the thing that makes them unique, no other animal among British fauna can do this, is the depth and the extent to which they root up the ground. So badgers can do it on a much smaller scale, but there's lots of things that boar do and do them much more effectively. So when they're rooting up the ground, they are looking for bulbs, for tubers, for roots, for grubs, for other invertebrates, for fungi. And that does lots of different things. Firstly, it mixes the different layers of soil together that would never normally be mixed if there was no animal like a boar around. It can mix the leaf litter in, and that obviously changes the chemical composition of the soil. It changes the very structure. It changes sort of the dynamics of bacteria and the mycorrhizal fungi and other organisms in there, like soil invertebrates. And so it can dry the soil out, not good in a drought, but then other times it can actually make the soil more fertile. And trees such as beech and oak have been found to grow better in that soil. But also it does seem that there's a relationship with jays. Jays probably find that soil very good to plant acorns in. If you do put your hands in it, it's very friable and soft and it's nice to walk on as well. But you can imagine a jay kind of finding that to be very good soil to plant acorns in. And very often in the Forest of Dean, I do see oak seedlings growing where the boar have rooted. And it's brilliant for a whole host of other plants. I mean, firstly, the boar often, they will go to swaths of bluebells or they will root among bracken. So they're also breaking up monocultures, which of course creates the opportunity for a greater diversity of plants to grow. And it wakes up the seed bank. So there are many wildflowers that have a better chance of growing, of germinating because of the boar. You see foxgloves growing amongst the bracken where the boar have been there. And obviously what's good for plants is it's good for insects, good for birds, etc. But that bare ground, before plants grow back on that bare ground, even the bare ground itself is amazing. We often think, everything should be covered in green, but not necessarily. Having that mosaic of landscape, having bare patches next to the greenery is actually brilliant for insects because it creates new microclimates, it creates nesting opportunities. And also there's, of course, the relationship that I think a lot of people are aware of now of birds or robins at least following gardeners around because we're essentially stimulating boar because we're exposing the soil. And a lot of birds, including robins, do follow boar around to pick at whatever invertebrate or seed, plant matter is exposed in the soil for them to forage on. And that's especially helpful in the winter when there's snow on the ground. And I've seen that in the Forest of Dean. And obviously that cascades up the ecosystem as well. And I mean, that's a starting point. And there are many other things that boar do, but that's kind of where it starts for trees. And boar will sometimes uproot seedlings, but it is give and take. It swings and roundabouts, and boar are an essential part of the cyclical renewal of our ecosystems, because disturbance is a fundamental part of ecosystems.
Yeah, it can feel counterproductive, but it's just parts of nature, isn't it? We struggle to get our heads around that sometimes.
Yeah.
And wild boar are also great transporters as well, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the term that scientists use is dispersal of other organisms. And I think it's something that a lot of us just don't really think about often. It's not something you can see with your own eyes. You can see, talking about like wolves in Yellowstone is the classic case of, an ecosystem, a positive ecosystem effect. And yeah, you can see a wolf taking down elk. What you can't really see so well is a boar transporting the spores of mycorrhizal fungi in their guts. But dispersal is a really important part of ecosystems, because obviously in a natural setting, different populations of species will often go locally extinct in certain areas. But usually that's not a problem, because often any animal, any species is going to be able to recolonize areas where they become locally extinct. And that, again, is part of the wider dynamism of ecosystems. But what the boar do is, as you say, they can transport other organisms, both on their bodies and in their bodies. So on their bodies, they've got this amazing shaggy fur. They're constantly picking up seeds on their forays through their habitat. Apparently they can catch seeds in the folds between their hooves. And they roam a lot in one day or night. So they're collecting all these seeds and then sprinkling them elsewhere. But then also they can carry a lot inside their bodies. So obviously, if you think about it, boar eat pretty much anything. So they can eat berries, they will eat mushrooms, they will eat anything in the soil. So when they're doing that, they are ingesting a lot of spores of fungi. They, of course, ingesting seeds, even soil invertebrates, or the eggs of soil invertebrates. And all those things pass through the digestive system. Some of them probably do get damaged or killed in the process, but then a lot of that actually survives and it comes out the other end in the dung. And there have been loads of studies finding that the dung of boar is packed with the spores of mycorrhizal fungi. So if you think of, you've got boar in a woodland foraging, they're picking up spores, they go somewhere else, perhaps they might wander onto a rewilding project where someone is trying to get some natural regeneration going on some ex-farmland. If the boar poo there, that's this gift package of mycorrhizal spores, which are, I think, as a lot of people know now, are really essential for the healthy functioning of most plants on Earth, including trees. And so that's a fantastic service that boar perform, because mycorrhizal fungi, doesn't really have ways of getting around by itself much, apart from sort of slowly growing through the forest floor. And similarly for soil invertebrates and aquatic invertebrates, there have been various studies, quite a new sort of finding really, that even tiny invertebrates or their eggs can survive the passage through the digestive system. And again, these are animals that obviously can't really colonize or go very far under their own steam. So the boar are taking them to new places. And so that, again, it could have amazing effects for regeneration of habitat and ecosystems in the UK, for example.
And just broadening things out a bit to think about wild boar as part of the pig family. And I'd just like to kind of dwell a little bit on the human relationship with animals of those species and that evolutionary lineage, if you like. You were speaking about beech and oak, for example, and thinking about our ecosystems that we've inherited since the last ice age. I know that pigs have really made a big impact on what we have now, or our animal husbandry traditions, and I think even the word acre might derive from the amount of land needed to feed one pig on acorns or pannage around oak trees. Have you done much research into those kind of associations and the origins of pig or boar human interplay?
Pannage is really fascinating. It's almost a shame that it doesn't happen more still. I know it's still practiced in the New Forest. And annoyingly, when I've looked into the pannage in the New Forest, they talk about how they put rings in the noses of the pigs, which hurts the pigs, but also the purpose is to stop them from, in the words of the New Forest website where I read this, damaging the woodland floor, which is bizarre because it's what they're doing. Rooting is good. It's the opposite of damage. So we're still not allowing those pigs to fully express their behaviours and their ecosystem role. But panic still goes on in some parts of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula where Iberico ham comes from. And funnily enough, boar and pigs there still mix and interbreed. And it's interesting you said about the dichotomy between pig and boar, because interestingly, unlike a lot of domestic species we have, like cattle and horses, the wild ancestors of those animals are no longer with us. The aurochs is gone, the wild horse, the tarpan is gone. But the boar is not gone. And that means that there is still plenty of opportunity for interbreeding and for those borders between pig and boar to constantly blur. And that's something we are really struggling with these days. Pigs have been in Europe for almost 8,000 years. So that's a lot of time for them to mix. And there are some scientists who say, actually, you struggle to find any pure in double quote marks, boar anywhere in Europe, roaming free. And it's funny because a lot of the criticism of or pushback on wild boar in the UK is that, these feral populations we've got now have all descended from stock that has been heavily or somewhat hybridized with pigs. Genetic studies they've done have shown that. But, firstly, if there aren't really many pure boar anywhere, where are you going to get them? You've got to work with what you've got. Secondly, we're in the Anthropocene. We've got to accept that we can't necessarily have purity. And I think to an extent, the whole purity thing is a bit of a cover for other reasons we don't want boar around, because there are other animals in the UK which are now living free, which have kind of an interesting ancestry, but we don't talk about that so much, like goshawks. They all escaped from captivity. That's where our wild goshawks come from now, but we don't talk about feral goshawks because they don't cause problems, but boar do. And with the wild boar, they've got a bit of pig in them, but they're still doing what wild boar is supposed to do, which is the important thing in my view. But to go back to your point about sort of pig versus boar, I guess another interesting thing is that pigs always seem to be on the cusp of trying to go back to the wild, because they do say that if a pig escapes, it's very, very quickly almost sort of changes in appearance. I think that's a bit exaggerated, and I don't think you get big pigs transforming back into boar within a generation or two. But certainly sort of there's almost this, like there's a boar just under the skin. There's this latency that you just don't get in cows and horses. The wild boar is always waiting to break out or reawaken.
And earlier on you were telling me about a difference in their brains actually between wild boar and domesticated pigs.
So all domestic animals, they've found that their brains have shrunk. That's almost part of the price of domestication. And actually pigs, out of all the domestic animals in the world, their brains have shrunk the most compared to, sort of what they were before. And it's thought that that's not necessarily going to be reflected in a change in IQ, but IQ is a human construct, I know, but intelligence. But the main thinking around this is that wild boar have this incredible sense of smell, and they use that to sniff things out under the soil in the soil. But domestic pigs don't need that so much because we're around to feed them. And so they've perhaps lost some of the hardware, the sense of smell hardware. Very scientific term, but they don't need that anymore. And that is part of what has led to their brain shrinkage. Yeah. And so I guess the logical sort of extension of that is that some domestic pigs, probably not the best ones to use on rewilding projects as proxies for wild boar. Even Tamworths. I assume Tamworths have smaller brains as well. I don't know of anyone who's put a Tamworth in an MRI scanner, let alone a wild boar. But they must have done, I suppose. But it's interesting that that's happened.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So Chantal, having become a successful author, if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you for a couple of tips, because this is kind of a bit hot off the press, but it's looking like, it's not 100% certain, that I might be in the next year or two writing a book that is very much the book version of The Meaning of Trees. And so assuming that all goes well for me, what would be your best advice from the get-go, and now that you're further down the track on that sort of journey?
Well, I'm very excited for you, Tom. I'm really excited at the prospect of hopefully reading that book one day. Probably the first thing I experienced when I did get this book deal, wasn't overwhelming euphoria as I thought I might, but actually an overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome.
I definitely know what that feels like.
Yeah. Quite a lot of panic. But eventually that died down. And I got down to the business of researching and writing. I would say actually being quite disciplined and organized with your research and your notes can really, really help, I find. Have a really good filing system. All of those things really can help and feel structured, and you can feel like you're doing something. And I've written novels in the past, bad novels that didn't get published, but that's so easy compared to a nonfiction book, really, because you could just make it up. And then with these nonfiction books, I honestly, with this Wild Boar book, I had no idea where to start, really, because, okay, some nonfiction books, they're like almost a quest style, and it's someone going around the UK, and it's like, it's quite easy to structure it, I think, chapter by chapter. But with the Wild Boar thing, I just had no idea in what order to tackle all these interrelated topics. I think you have to accept that you're going to do a lot of chapter shuffling and moving content between different chapters and amalgamating or killing whole chapters.
Yep.
And you just got to accept that book is in such a process of flux the whole time. It does help actually to just write chapters and individual documents.
Okay.
There's no point writing it all in a single document, I think. Yeah, it's a painful part of the process, but you will get through it.
I've got a feeling you might shoot me a look here when I say this, but basically I need to grow a thick skin like a wild boar.
Yeah.
Thanks for humouring me. You're already starting to think about another book, aren't you? And building on the work that you've done looking into wild boar. Perhaps you'd like to talk about that for a little bit. Yeah,
and this book really does build on the interviews and the research I did for the Wild Boar book, because writing a book, especially a nonfiction book, is always going to be an enlightening process. But in the process of researching the Wild Boar book, I spoke to a lot of experts, people who have cultured and their knowledge in this area. But what a lot of them said is that wild boar are brilliant, but they're not enough. They're a start. But we also need all of these other big animals that we're missing, especially in the UK. I mean, megafauna, big animals, are missing from a lot of places in very large numbers, but we are especially poor in them in the UK. And that's why there is now such a growing movement of putting horses and cattle and indeed pigs back into many landscapes in this country, rather than just doing it for farming purposes, because we are waking up to that. But I think a lot of people just, and even myself, have just really don't know how much the world is currently missing and how the world is suffering from that absence, because big animals have unique roles to play in ecosystems that smaller animals, even a large number of small animals, cannot play. And we lost most of our megafauna towards around the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the last ice age, by about 12,000 years ago. And our ecosystems haven't recovered from that yet, because that's a blink of time in terms of evolution and ecology, really. And so sort of waking up to that truth, it sort of made me realize, well, I want to write a book on this, about what we're missing and how we can begin to redress the damage.
Do you mind just mentioning some of the more characteristic species that people might be able to identify with?
Yeah, I think probably ground sloths. Everyone loves a ground sloth. I bet a lot of people have been to the Natural History Museum, and there's that corridor with Mary Anning's ichthyosaur and other skeletons, and then you've got the actual skeleton of a ground sloth at the end. And it seems like there was a giant version of everything. We had the cave hyena in Europe. We had giant kangaroos and giant wombats in Australia. There it was a giant peccary in the USA. So a peccary is essentially America's version of a pig. We had elephants, of course, elephants and rhinos in Europe, and quite possibly we might still have them if humans hadn't loved eating them so much.
Yeah, it must be great to be delving into that one then. And what are the next steps with that project? Yeah,
I've got a few research trips coming up, some of them in Europe, and then I'm also going to go to the US, where they have done better in terms of recovering or maintaining their megafauna populations. I'm really looking forward to that, and to speak to people on the ground, people who have really lived their lives alongside big animals, whereas I can't really say the same, although I'm trying to change that.
In our chat just now, you described to me wild boar as the Swiss Army knife of animals. How can they take on that title?
Yeah, well, I have to say, firstly, that's sadly not my quote. It was from this Netflix documentary on wild boar, and I thought, my God, I wish I'd come up with that. The best place to start with that explanation is talking about actually the big cat family. So you think about cats, big cats, small cats. There are tons of cats all over the world, so many species. I swear every year I hear about one I didn't know about before. But the pig family actually has very few pigs in it. And it seems that that is because the wild boar has proven to be such a successful and adaptable form that this single pig species is essentially the pig species of Europe and Asia, even going into the northern rim of Africa. And so basically there's been no need for the wild boar to radiate into other species. There are pigs like there are warthogs, there are red river hogs in Africa, Southeast Asia. There are ones like the babirusa and the Visayan warty pig. But the wild boar is completely dominant in Europe and Asia, which is incredible because obviously there's a gigantic range of environments and biomes in those places. But the wild boar are just so adaptable, which does make it rather puzzling in a way that they haven't thrived as much as you would expect them to in the UK. They've been back for 30 years and we've got a good population in the Forest of Dean. But we know the answer to that, which is that they're being shot at so much. There are lots of people around the Forest of Dean who shoot them, and legally they can. And I do agree that we do need to cull them to an extent because we're their only natural predator at the moment. But I would love to see them be allowed to spread more. But elsewhere outside the UK, they are thriving, probably a bit too much now. There's lots of human reasons behind why wild boar have become even more successful than they used to be. And that's not necessarily a good thing for other wildlife and for the environment. But nevertheless, wild boar are just such a successful species. And I think in a way it does give me hope in that whatever happens in the future to humanity, to the planet, some descendant of a wild boar will be around in 5 million years' time. Probably might look just like a wild boar today still, given how adaptable and Swiss Army knife-ish they are.
Yeah, and even the patch of the Forest of Dean we went to, we parked in a residential street nearby, and literally you could even see on the residential verges that there'd been some rootling activity there from them. Thank you so much for sharing all this deep knowledge about the wild boar, and it's a great, hopefully, teaser for your book and for people to go and invest in that. I just wonder, you've had such a rich kind of journey with them and getting to know them and clearly advocating for them as well. And I wondered how wild boar kind of make you feel. Is it okay to ask that?
Yeah, it's funny. It's such a simple question, but I guess no one's ever actually asked me. They do make me feel hopeful and happy. And whenever I go to the Forest of Dean, it's a very small chance that I'll see them, but there's that hope, and it's a wonderful sort of spark of warmth inside, because we are so impoverished. Whenever I walk in a really big woodland now in the UK, I just think, no boar. It doesn't feel right. And it shouldn't feel right because it isn't right, because they and so many other animals that we're missing, they should be here, but they're not in most parts of the country. And so they make me feel hopeful and they make me feel happy. And obviously it's an absolute thrill when I actually do see them. They make me laugh. I have laughed at a lot of the trail camera footage I've watched. But of course they make me sad because they do also sort of show what we are missing and what we are still missing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Chantal. Definitely on our walk just now, I was seeing the forest there different to how I've ever seen a woodland. And I've been in a lot of them. And I'm really grateful to you imparting that new way of experiencing a forest. And we didn't see a wild boar. And I'm absolutely fine with that because I know that they're in their boartropolis, as you described it, in those really brambly patches, doing their thing. And they'll be out tonight, no doubt about it. But there were so many clues that you helped to point out, whether it was their poo, their scat. We saw some trotter marks, didn't we? And holes in the bramble, kind of boar sized where they would have gone in. Lightly ploughed areas in the woodland as well that were sure to become really fertile new patches for wildflowers, and the odd kind of hollow here and there that would be brilliant for making pools of water that will then lead to other biodiversity. And so that kind of optimism that you speak of, I definitely felt a bit of that on our walk just now. So yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that.
Thanks for coming along.
So moving towards the end of our interview, I've got 2 more questions for you. The first one is, what would a perfect world look like that is compatible for these megafauna, wild boar included, and human beings to coexist? Or, yeah, where do you stand with that kind of equation?
I think technology could help us a little bit, but I think what we need to do is we need to give some things up. We need to share the world better with other beings. It really, at the end of the day, comes down to sharing. I think between people as well, because economic justice is essential, I think, for environmental justice and environmental restoration. Everyone wants to feel economically secure. And we have to share, because in the moment, I mean, part of the conflict with the wild boar is that a lot of people are unwilling to change their behavior. I mean, there's a lot of dialogue now about dogs running loose in nature reserves and killing birds or preventing birds from foraging. And there's so much entitlement. Oh, how dare I be told that my dog has to be on a lead? And that for me is emblematic of the fact that we will not yield sort of space or time or bother for other animals. And it is selfish, and obviously that is what has led to the climate and the biodiversity crises. And we need to do things like changing our diets. We need to really not necessarily go vegan, but we really need to substantially reduce the amount of meat in our diets. And obviously there are other things we need to cut down on. We need to stop fast fashion, for example, everything like that. And all of those things, we really have to share resources. We can't keep burning through them at the rate that we're doing. We can't keep demanding and consuming more and more. And for me, we have to solve that if we're going to enable the space, the biomass for other animals, especially big animals.
And I think you said to me earlier, that's a new challenge for humanity.
Yeah, because never in human history have we reined ourselves back in that way. It's going to be the hardest thing we've ever done, but I feel like surely we can do it.
Thank you so much for a really enlightening discussion. And I'm going to hand to you for a final message. What would you like that to be?
Oh, I'm on the spot now. I guess just try to absorb as much knowledge and wonder about the natural world that you can, and try to notice things, and take time every day to learn a new plant species, or get to know, sort of recognize different bird songs, sort of noticing nature. Obviously that helps you build your connection. Read books, listen to podcasts like this one, be curious, and also talk to people. I mean, I just heard of a study recently saying that the dial can shift on climate change in terms of people's attitudes when they are hearing people talking about it. And even in my own family, my own family has really reduced their meat consumption. So don't be afraid to talk about these things, and who knows where it could lead to.
Been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.